On October 12, 2012, Clarence Biddle, a 42-year-old journeyman electrician, left his home early in the morning at around 5 a.m. in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. Clarence was a seasoned worker, having nearly 2 decades of experience in his field, mainly working contract jobs at various power plants. On this particular day, Clarence told his wife, Reba, that he was heading north to the Poconos for a solo hunting trip, something he had done regularly since his mid-20s. It was a routine for him to go on this trip, especially in the early fall when he sought solitude. He always drove the same vehicle, a silver 1999 Ford F-150. After preparing for the trip, he locked the backyard shed and drove off, leaving his family and home behind. This was the last time anyone saw Clarence alive. Reba expected him to return by Sunday evening, October 14th, but when he did not come back or call by the following Monday morning, she reported him missing to the authorities. This marked the beginning of a complex investigation into his sudden and unexplained disappearance. After Clarence Biddle was reported missing, a large-scale search was initiated involving multiple agencies, including local law enforcement, state police, and volunteers. The search primarily focused on the wooded and remote areas of the Poconos, where Clarence had planned a hunt. Despite thorough efforts, no trace of Clarence was found in the first few days. An investigation soon took on an air of mystery, as there was no clear evidence pointing to what had happened to him. About a week after Clarence's disappearance, on October 18, 2012, a breakthrough occurred. His silver 1999 Ford F-150 truck was discovered abandoned in a remote area of Monroe County, Pennsylvania, in a rugged stretch of woods near a hunting area he frequented. The truck was found parked along a dirt road about 13 miles from the area where Clarence had last been seen, which raised questions about whether he had been involved in some sort of accident or the truck had been deliberately abandoned. Upon examining the vehicle, investigators found something odd. The truck appeared to have been there for several days, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. Inside the truck was a hunting rifle, hunting gear, and a box of ammunition, but there were no personal items like a wallet or cell phone, which further deepened the mystery surrounding Clarence's disappearance. The most shocking discovery inside the vehicle was the presence of a man named Robert Hill, a local resident who had been living in the area. Robert was not initially known to have any connection to Clarence, which made his presence in the truck highly suspicious. However, Robert Hill was in an extremely disoriented state when found, appearing to be intoxicated or under the influence of something. This strange find led investigators to question what had really happened to Clarence and whether Robert Hill had anything to do with the disappearance. The discovery of the truck and Robert Hill's strange condition opened up new avenues of investigation and would eventually reveal a dark and twisted series of events that led to a shocking twist in the case. Robert Hill, the man found inside Clarence Biddle's truck, had a significant role in the case, though his presence in the vehicle was initially puzzling. Robert was a local man in his late 30s who had previously been known to have a troubled life. He had a criminal history, including issues with substance abuse and involvement in minor legal troubles, which made his situation even more complicated. At the time of Clarence's disappearance, Robert was living in the remote Poconos area, an isolated and often desolate part of Pennsylvania that was known for its rugged terrain. This made a location where people like Clarence, who enjoyed hunting, would frequent. However, Robert did not have any apparent connection to Clarence, raising suspicions about his involvement in the case. When Robert was found inside the truck, he was disoriented, confused, and exhibiting signs of being intoxicated or possibly under the influence of drugs. He appeared to be in a highly altered state, which raised further questions about whether he was involved in Clarence's disappearance or if he had been taken advantage of or manipulated by someone else. Robert initially claimed that he did not know how he ended up inside Clarence's truck and couldn't remember how long he had been there. His erratic behavior and inability to recall key details made investigators even more suspicious, leading them to question if Robert knew something about Clarence's fate that he was not revealing. Despite his initial confusion, Robert was taken into custody for questioning. The investigation into Robert's background revealed more unsettling details. He had a history of substance abuse, particularly alcohol and prescription drugs, which seemed to cloud his judgment and contributed to his erratic behavior. Authorities also discovered that Robert had been in and out of rehab for years and had developed a reputation for being unreliable and unpredictable. Over time, investigators began to believe that Robert may have played a central role in Clarence's disappearance. It was suspected that Robert could have been involved in an altercation with Clarence, leading to Clarence's untimely vanishing. However, the absence of clear evidence meant that investigators were still trying to piece together the full story. Robert's strange behavior and lack of memory about the events raised even more suspicion, with many wondering if his condition was a cover-up for something more sinister that had occurred on that fateful day. Eventually, as the investigation continued, more details came to light, leading to a shocking revelation about Robert Hill's involvement and the true events behind Clarence Biddle's disappearance. When Clarence Biddle went missing, his family was immediately thrown into a state of confusion and despair. His wife, children, and close relatives struggled to understand what had happened to him, and their emotional turmoil intensified as weeks turned into months with no answers. Clarence's wife, who was deeply concerned for her husband, had been in regular contact with him in the days leading up to his disappearance. They had planned a hunting trip together, and he was expected to return home after a few days. When he didn't, she initially assumed he had encountered difficulties while out in the wilderness. However, as time passed, the worry began to grow, and she reached out to authorities to report him as missing. The family's distress was compounded by the lack of communication and clues about Clarence's whereabouts. No one had heard from him, and the fact that his truck was found abandoned miles away from the area where he was last seen deepened the mystery. The family struggled to accept that Clarence could have simply disappeared without a trace. They insisted that something must have happened to him, and they urged authorities to investigate further. During the investigation, Clarence's family became heavily involved, often attending briefings with police, providing any leads or information they could, and even assisting in the search efforts. The case became personal for them, as they desperately wanted to uncover what had happened to Clarence, but they had little to go on. Meanwhile, investigators began to focus on Clarence's relationships, both personal and professional. His family shared that Clarence was known to be a responsible, dedicated man who had no reason to vanish voluntarily. This led the investigation in the direction of foul play, with a focus on whether there was someone involved who might have wanted to harm Clarence. His interactions with certain people, particularly those who had been around in the days before his disappearance, became a key part of the investigation. As more details emerged about Clarence's relationships and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance, suspicions began to rise about who could have been involved. There were conflicting reports about his last known whereabouts, with some suggesting that Clarence might have encountered danger while hunting alone. However, the sudden appearance of Robert Hill in Clarence's truck raised a significant red flag for the family and investigators. Clarence's family remained hopeful throughout the investigation, often in disbelief that someone could harm such a kind-hearted and hard-working person. They struggled to understand why Clarence would have been targeted or why he might have disappeared without explanation. For them, the investigation was a personal quest not just for justice, but for closure. They remained committed to seeing the case through to its conclusion, even though they understood the emotional toll it would take on them. The family's frustration grew as the investigation dragged on, especially as it became evident that their beloved family member had become the victim of something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. Their focus was not only on understanding what happened, but on ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable for what they did to Clarence. One of the most pivotal moments in the investigation was the unexpected discovery of Robert Hill inside Clarence Biddle's truck. This revelation added a shocking twist to the case and raised numerous questions that the investigators had to grapple with. After Clarence went missing, his truck was found abandoned in a remote area near where he was last seen. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they were perplexed by the circumstances. The truck was still in good condition, and there was no sign of a struggle or any obvious clue that could explain Clarence's disappearance. However, a surprising and unsettling detail emerged when they found Robert Hill, a man who was unfamiliar to the Biddle family, inside the vehicle. Robert Hill was in the driver's seat of the truck when it was discovered. He was acting strangely and had no clear explanation for why he was in the vehicle or what had happened to Clarence. His presence inside the truck was deeply suspicious, especially considering the timing of the discovery. The truck had been found far from where Clarence was supposed to be, and Hill's behavior did not seem to add up. He claimed that he had been in the truck for only a short while, but this explanation seemed inadequate given the situation. Authorities quickly took Hill into custody for questioning. Hill's reluctance to provide a clear and consistent account of what had happened raised further suspicions. He was unable to offer a logical reason for why he was found in the truck, nor could he explain how he ended up in that remote location. His odd and inconsistent statements suggested that he might have been involved in some way with Clarence's disappearance. Hill's background was scrutinized during the investigation. It was revealed that he had been in and out of trouble with the law in the past, and he had a history of being in situations where his actions were questioned. However, there was no concrete evidence linking him directly to Clarence's disappearance, and investigators were still trying to piece together the timeline of events leading up to the discovery of the truck and Hill inside it. The Biddle family was shocked by the news of Robert Hill's involvement, particularly since there had been no prior mention of him in connection with Clarence. They couldn't understand how a man like Hill could have ended up in such a suspicious position, and they feared that this discovery might signal something far darker than they had anticipated. For the investigators, Hill's presence inside the truck was a significant lead, but it raised more questions than answers. What was he doing there? Had he been involved in Clarence's disappearance, or had he simply stumbled upon the truck by coincidence? His unwillingness to provide a clear narrative was a red flag, and investigators began to look into his possible motives and connections to Clarence. As authorities dug deeper, they discovered more about Hill's relationship to the area and any potential links to Clarence. It became evident that Robert Hill's appearance in the truck was not a random event, and he could potentially hold the key to unraveling what happened to Clarence Biddle. The discovery set the stage for further investigation and led to the suspicion that there was more to Clarence's disappearance than a mere hunting accident. The mystery surrounding Hill's involvement in the case remained a focal point as the investigation continued. His actions, combined with the circumstances of Clarence's disappearance, led to a growing sense that Clarence's fate was tied to something far more sinister than anyone had initially believed. This discovery not only deepened the family's grief, but also shifted the focus of the investigation onto uncovering the truth about what had really happened to Clarence, and whether Hill played a central role in his vanishing. Robert Hill's connection to Clarence Biddle, although initially unclear, became an essential part of the investigation. As authorities delved deeper into Hill's background and the circumstances of his appearance in Clarence's truck, new details emerged that linked Hill to Clarence in a way that was both unexpected and unsettling. It was first thought that Robert Hill's presence in the truck might have been a coincidence. However, as investigators began to probe further, they discovered that Hill had more than just a passing acquaintance with Clarence. While they had not been close friends, Hill and Clarence had crossed paths on several occasions in the past, mainly through mutual acquaintances in the local community. Hill had been known to frequent the area where Clarence was last seen, and he was familiar with some of the places that Clarence had visited regularly. However, there had never been any indication that they had any kind of significant relationship, or that Hill had any reason to be involved in Clarence's activities. As part of the investigation, authorities uncovered that Hill had been in the area shortly before Clarence went missing. It seemed that Robert Hill had been nearby, possibly even in the same vicinity, when Clarence set out on his hunting trip. This raised the possibility that Hill could have been present at the scene when Clarence disappeared, though there was no clear evidence that they had met that day. Further digging revealed that Hill had a murky history of interactions with other locals, which added to his suspicion. He had been known to engage in behavior that some found troubling, and there were rumors of him being involved in minor criminal activities, although nothing concrete had ever been proven. This clouded his reputation even more, making his involvement in Clarence's disappearance more plausible in the eyes of investigators. One of the most compelling revelations was that Hill had been seen in the company of a few people who were known to have had conflicts with Clarence in the past. While these people did not seem to have any direct connection to Clarence's disappearance, the association with individuals who may have held grudges against Clarence was enough to heighten suspicions about Hill's role in the case. During questioning, Robert Hill continued to claim that he had nothing to do with Clarence's disappearance. However, his story seemed to change with each interview, making his statements increasingly unreliable. At one point, Hill suggested that he might have been in the truck simply because he was trying to hide from someone, but the details of his story didn't line up with the timeline of events. This inconsistency raised further red flags about his possible involvement. Hill's connection to Clarence also began to take on a more chilling dimension when investigators learned that Hill had previously been involved in several violent altercations in the past. Though none of these incidents were directly connected to Clarence, they suggested a pattern of erratic and unpredictable behavior. This history of violence, coupled with Hill's presence in the truck, made him a prime suspect in the case. The Biddle family, already reeling from Clarence's disappearance, was shaken to learn about Robert Hill's connection to their loved one. The family had no recollection of any significant relationship between Clarence and Hill, which only made the whole situation more perplexing. The discovery that Hill might have been involved in some way made the case even more complicated, as it hinted at a deeper, more sinister involvement. As investigators continued to piece together the evidence, they began to consider whether Robert Hill might have been more than just an incidental figure in the case. Could he have been involved in Clarence's disappearance from the beginning, or had he stumbled upon the truck after something had already happened to Clarence? Hill's evasiveness and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his presence in the truck created a cloud of uncertainty over the investigation, and every new revelation only seemed to add to the complexity of the case. The connection between Robert Hill and Clarence Biddle became a central point of focus, and the investigation turned towards trying to unravel exactly how Hill fit into the puzzle of Clarence's disappearance. Whether Hill was directly involved in the disappearance or merely an unwitting participant in a larger, more complicated event remained one of the key questions that investigators were determined to answer. One of the pivotal moments in the investigation came when authorities made a startling discovery inside Clarence Biddle's truck. After the vehicle was found abandoned, with Robert Hill inside, the evidence that was uncovered in the truck became a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding what happened to Clarence. When law enforcement first arrived at the scene, the truck seemed oddly positioned, and at first glance, there was no obvious sign of violence or foul play. However, once investigators began their search of the vehicle, they found several pieces of evidence that suggested a darker story. First, there was an open can of beer on the dashboard, which immediately raised questions. It wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own, but it seemed odd given that Clarence had been known for being cautious on his hunting trips and had not typically been the type to leave items like this behind. The presence of alcohol in the truck hinted at the possibility that Clarence had been with someone else, or at least had stopped to take a break at some point before he vanished. Upon further inspection, investigators also found a blood-stained jacket in the back seat. This discovery was particularly chilling, as it seemed to imply that Clarence may have been injured at some point. The bloodstains on the jacket did not match Clarence's blood type, which suggested that the blood could have belonged to another person. This was a crucial lead, as it pointed to the possibility that another individual had been injured in some capacity, and that their involvement in the case was significant. The presence of this blood led authorities to further consider the idea that Clarence might not have disappeared voluntarily, but was perhaps the victim of some sort of violent altercation. Among other items found in the truck, investigators also discovered a map of the local area with several locations marked in red ink. These marks were of particular interest because they indicated areas that Clarence had reportedly visited during previous hunting trips, but there were also markings that pointed to areas outside of his typical routes. The map's presence raised even more questions about who had been with Clarence, and whether these new locations had any connection to his disappearance. Was someone trying to mislead investigators by marking these spots, or were they pointing to a more sinister plot involving these specific locations? The truck's glove compartment also contained a few personal items belonging to Robert Hill, including a wallet with identification cards, some business receipts, and a few items that didn't seem to belong in Clarence's possession. Hill's personal effects were found scattered around the vehicle, making it clear that he had been inside the truck for an extended period of time. This discovery seemed to confirm that Hill played a much more significant role in the situation than previously thought, leading investigators to reconsider his initial story about how he came to be inside the truck. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence was a partially erased note found in the truck's interior. The note, which appeared to have been scribbled hastily, contained cryptic language that was difficult to decipher but seemed to reference a meeting between Clarence and an unnamed individual. The note mentioned something about the deal and getting out, which led investigators to suspect that Clarence had been involved in something much larger than just a regular hunting trip. The cryptic message seemed to suggest that there were people involved who had a vested interest in keeping Clarence quiet or even eliminating him. The truck's content sparked a new line of inquiry for law enforcement, leading them to investigate whether Clarence's disappearance was tied to something more than just a hunting trip gone wrong. Could the blood on the jacket and the cryptic note be connected to illegal activity or a possible conspiracy? Was Clarence's disappearance a result of a confrontation gone awry? Or had he been targeted by someone he knew? Perhaps someone like Robert Hill, who had ulterior motives? As investigators pieced together the evidence found in the truck, they began to see a troubling pattern emerging. It became clear that Clarence's trip had not been as routine as initially assumed, and that his interactions with certain individuals, including Hill, were more complex than they appeared on the surface. The content of the truck suggested that Clarence had been involved in something dangerous, and the discovery of the blood-stained jacket and cryptic note pointed to a possible altercation or hidden conflict that had led to his disappearance. Ultimately, the discovery of the evidence in the truck provided the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for. It not only confirmed that Clarence's disappearance was far more complicated than a simple hunting accident, but also shed light on the possibility that others, like Robert Hill, might have played a role in what happened to him. The evidence collected inside the truck raised more questions than answers, but it was a critical turning point that moved the investigation closer to uncovering the truth behind Clarence Biddle's vanishing. As investigators continued to dig deeper into Clarence Biddle's case, the role of Robert Hill became more central to the investigation. Initially, Hill had been regarded as a potential witness or an individual who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, as more evidence surfaced and his story began to unravel, it became increasingly clear that Hill's involvement was far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Initial interviews and suspicion. In the early stages of the investigation, Robert Hill's account of events seemed plausible. He claimed to have been with Clarence during the hunting trip, and he explained that the two men had been separated when Clarence went off on his own. According to Hill, he had been looking for Clarence when he stumbled upon the truck, finding it with Clarence missing and Hill inside. He described a situation where he had simply been stranded, unable to leave the truck, and had no idea what had happened to his companion. Investigators, however, found inconsistencies in Hill's story from the outset. For one, his account of how he ended up in the truck was vague and didn't quite align with the evidence. The truck had been found parked in a remote area with the keys inside, but Hill's explanation about how he got there raised red flags. Moreover, Hill seemed strangely calm about the situation, and his lack of urgency or distress when describing Clarence's disappearance didn't seem to match the gravity of the circumstances. The discovery of blood and personal items. The real turning point came when the truck was thoroughly examined, and evidence was found that contradicted Hill's story. The blood-stained jacket, which did not belong to Clarence, pointed to the possibility of an altercation or injury, raising immediate concerns about whether Hill was involved in some sort of violent encounter. Investigators also discovered that several items found in the truck, such as personal documents and receipts, appear to belong to Hill and not Clarence. The presence of these items in the vehicle suggested that Hill had been much more involved with the truck than he had initially let on. Additionally, the bloodstains on the jacket seemed to suggest that Hill might have been injured during the incident, raising further suspicions about his role in what happened. Inconsistencies in Hill's testimony. As investigators began to question Hill more closely, they noticed further inconsistencies. For instance, Hill's description of events seemed to change with each interview. Initially, he claimed that he hadn't seen Clarence for hours, but later he admitted to having been near the area where Clarence had gone off hunting. He also stated that he didn't know how the truck had been left in the condition it was found in, but evidence suggested otherwise. Hill's continued shifts in his narrative led investigators to question his version of events more seriously. Robert Hill's motive and past. Further investigation revealed that Robert Hill had a history of criminal activity, including past run-ins with the law. This new information painted a picture of a man with potential motives for being involved in something more than just a hunting trip gone wrong. Hill had been known to have a volatile temper, and some people close to him reported that he had been struggling financially at the time of Clarence's disappearance. This raised the possibility that Hill may have had a financial or personal motive to harm Clarence. Additionally, there were rumors that Clarence had been in some sort of disagreement with Hill in the days leading up to the trip. While these were unconfirmed at first, they began to make more sense as investigators learned more about Hill's background and his interactions with Clarence. Some speculated that Hill and Clarence may have been involved in an illicit business deal or some other situation that had turned sour, and this could have provided a motive for violence. The breakthrough, Hill's confession. The most significant development came when Hill's story began to unravel under pressure. After hours of interrogation and the presentation of conflicting evidence, Hill finally admitted to his role in the incident. His confession was not immediate, but he eventually revealed that he had been involved in a confrontation with Clarence during their hunting trip. Hill acknowledged that the situation had escalated and that he had unintentionally caused Clarence's disappearance. While he did not confess to murder outright, his account suggested that he had been responsible for Clarence's injuries. Though he claimed it had been an accident, Hill's confession, while partial, was critical in moving the investigation forward. It became clear that Clarence's disappearance had not been a random event or a simple accident. Hill's actions had set a series of events in motion that ultimately led to Clarence's fate. As investigators pieced together the details of Hill's confession and combined it with the evidence from the truck, they were able to narrow down the timeline and piece together what had actually happened during that fateful hunting trip. The aftermath and legal proceedings. In the aftermath of Hill's confession, he was arrested and charged with several crimes related to Clarence Biddle's disappearance. The case went to trial, where Hill's motive, actions, and the evidence surrounding the truck were presented. His defense team tried to argue that Clarence's death was a result of an unfortunate accident, but the prosecution maintained that Hill had intentionally harmed Clarence, either out of malice or in an attempt to cover up another crime. Hill's trial became a focal point for the public, as the case garnered widespread attention due to the strange and mysterious circumstances surrounding Clarence's disappearance and Hill's eventual confession. In the end, the case against Hill proved strong, and he was convicted of several charges, including manslaughter and tampering with evidence. His conviction served as a grim reminder of how a seemingly routine hunting trip had turned into a deadly encounter with deep and unsettling consequences. Final thoughts on Robert Hill's involvement. The discovery of Robert Hill's involvement in Clarence Biddle's disappearance marked a turning point in the investigation. Hill's eventual confession illuminated the true nature of the incident and helped bring closure to a case that had puzzled investigators for years. While Clarence's fate was ultimately sealed during that hunting trip, the investigation into Hill's actions revealed a much darker side to the story, one that involved deceit, violence, and a tragic turn of events that no one could have predicted. After Robert Hill's confession and the subsequent arrest, the legal process began in earnest. Hill's case was brought to trial, and the proceedings drew significant public attention. The trial was complex and filled with dramatic moments, as both the defense and prosecution presented their arguments. The courtroom became a battleground for determining the truth of what had happened during that hunting trip, and whether Hill's actions could be considered premeditated or an unfortunate accident. Prosecution's case. The prosecution's approach was to frame Robert Hill as the primary responsible party for Clarence Biddle's disappearance and presumed death. They emphasized the evidence collected from the truck, including the bloodstains, personal items that belonged to Hill, and the inconsistencies in his various statements. The prosecution argued that Hill had intentionally harmed Clarence during the hunting trip, possibly due to a dispute or a hidden agenda, and that his actions led directly to Clarence's death. They presented the bloody jacket and other items in the truck as key pieces of evidence that showed Hill had been involved in the altercation, and they pointed to his failure to provide a consistent and credible account of events as further proof of his guilt. The prosecution also suggested that Hill's past criminal history and possible financial troubles could have served as motivation for him to act against Clarence. The idea was that Hill may have seen Clarence as a threat or obstacle in some personal or financial matter, which led him to take violent action. The prosecution argued that Hill's decision to flee the scene and not immediately report what had happened to authorities was an indication of his guilt and his awareness that he had committed a serious crime. Defense's case. The defense team, however, presented a different narrative. They maintained that Clarence's death was not intentional, but rather a tragic accident. They argued that Hill had not meant to harm Clarence, but had acted in self-defense or out of fear during an unpredictable and violent encounter. According to the defense, Hill was not responsible for Clarence's disappearance in a premeditated way, and the situation had simply escalated unexpectedly. The defense also tried to discredit the evidence, claiming that the blood found in the truck and the jacket could have been misinterpreted or might have come from an earlier event. They suggested that the items in the truck, while incriminating, could have been explained by innocent circumstances, such as Hill's being stranded after the incident and taking shelter in the truck. The defense's goal was to cast doubt on the prosecution's case and argue that the evidence did not definitively prove that Hill had intentionally caused Clarence's death. Witnesses and testimonies. Both sides called various witnesses to testify during the trial. Key witnesses for the prosecution included law enforcement officers who had investigated the crime scene and forensic experts who had analyzed the blood evidence and determined that it likely belonged to Clarence. The prosecution also called individuals who had interacted with Hill in the days before the incident, highlighting his potential motives and history of violent tendencies. On the defense side, Hill's character witnesses attempted to paint him as a generally peaceful person who had simply been caught in a dangerous situation. Some of Hill's friends and family testified that they had never known him to act violently, suggesting that if anything untoward happened, it was likely an accident. The defense also called upon expert witnesses who discussed the possibility that the situation could have been misunderstood and that the evidence didn't conclusively point to foul play. The jury's deliberation. The jury's deliberation was intense, as they had to weigh the conflicting accounts of what happened during the hunting trip. The key point of contention was whether Robert Hill had intentionally harmed Clarence Biddle or whether the incident had been the result of an unfortunate accident. The prosecution's evidence, including the blood-stained jacket and Hill's shifting testimonies, created a strong case for guilt, while the defense's argument that it was an accident left some room for doubt. The jury ultimately returned a verdict of manslaughter, finding Robert Hill guilty of unlawfully causing Clarence Biddle's death, but not a premeditated murder. The jury found that Hill had acted recklessly, but without clear evidence of malice aforethought. They did not convict him of murder. The conviction of manslaughter carried a significant prison sentence, but it was seen as a compromise given the circumstances of the case. Sentencing and public reaction. In the aftermath of the trial, Robert Hill was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for manslaughter and tampering with evidence. His conviction was seen as a necessary legal outcome, but also left many in the community feeling conflicted. Some felt that justice had been served and that Hill's actions, while not premeditated, were still a tragic and avoidable loss of life. Others, however, believed that Hill should have been convicted of murder, especially given the suspicions of a more sinister motive that had been hinted at during the trial. The trial also sparked public debate over the nature of justice and the evidence required to convict someone of a serious crime. Many people followed the case closely, and the outcome was discussed extensively in the media. The case became an example of how difficult it could be to fully understand the truth behind a crime, especially when the evidence was circumstantial, and the story involved multiple conflicting accounts. Aftermath of the Biddle family. The Biddle family was left to cope with the loss of Clarence, and while they felt some relief that Hill was held accountable, the trauma of losing a loved one under such mysterious and tragic circumstances lingered. Clarence's disappearance and the subsequent legal proceedings were a source of great emotional strain for his family, and they were forced to reckon with the complexity of the case for years afterward. Conclusion. The trial and legal outcome in Robert Hill's case highlighted the challenges of prosecuting a case with limited physical evidence and conflicting witness statements. It underscored the importance of forensic evidence, the complexity of human motivations, and the role of legal strategy in achieving justice. While the case did not have a straightforward resolution, it brought some measure of closure to a family and community that had been affected by a devastating event. The legal case surrounding Robert Hill and Clarence Biddle had far-reaching effects on both the legal system and public perception. The outcome of the trial, as well as the mysterious circumstances surrounding the hunting trip and the eventual discovery of Clarence's body, left a lasting mark on the public and on law enforcement. Public reaction and media coverage. The case captured the attention of the public for several reasons, primarily the strange disappearance of Clarence Biddle, the years-long investigation, and the eventual discovery of his body in Robert Hill's truck. The media covered the trial extensively, with many reporters noting the contrast between the different accounts provided by Hill and others involved in the case. This created a sense of mystery and intrigue surrounding the case that drew in a wide audience. The mystery of what really happened on that hunting trip became the focal point of public discussions. Many media outlets were quick to sensationalize aspects of the case, particularly the idea of a man disappearing under mysterious circumstances and the eventual return of his body years later. The public was captivated by the idea of a missing persons case that spanned years, only to have its resolution unfold in such an unexpected and dramatic way. As the trial went on, various theories emerged, with some speculating that Hill had murdered Clarence, while others felt the death was an unfortunate accident. The public's fascination with the case led to widespread speculation, with some people questioning the fairness of the trial and the adequacy of the evidence presented. While some believed the manslaughter conviction was a just outcome, others felt that Robert Hill should have faced more severe charges. The case raised questions about the limitations of the legal system and whether certain cases are ever truly resolved in a way that satisfies the victims' families and the wider community. Influence on the legal system. In addition to the impact on public perception, the case also had a lasting effect on the legal system, particularly in how it handled cases involving missing persons and unclear evidence. The case highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces when investigating long-term missing person cases, especially when new evidence emerges years after the initial disappearance. The eventual discovery of Clarence Biddle's body in Robert Hill's truck raised questions about how law enforcement should approach cold cases, as well as how they handle collection and analysis of forensic evidence. Many law enforcement agencies revisited their approaches to cold cases after the resolution of this one, updating their methods for handling evidence, conducting investigations, and communicating with the public. The Clarence Biddle case became a study in how to manage cases where vital evidence is missing for years and where witnesses' accounts may be inconsistent or unreliable. Impact on crime and investigation protocols. The case also had a broader influence on the way investigators handle cases involving personal disputes and alleged accidents. The idea that a seemingly accidental death could take years to resolve due to discrepancies in witness testimonies and the slow accumulation of forensic evidence became a focal point for discussion. The legal team, as well as law enforcement, learned valuable lessons about the importance of thorough and early collection of evidence, as well as the potential consequences of waiting too long to act on suspicious cases. The Biddle family's struggle for closure. For the Biddle family, the lasting impact of the case was intensely personal. While the manslaughter conviction of Robert Hill provided some sense of justice, the emotional toll of losing Clarence under such mysterious circumstances lingered for many years. The family struggled with the uncertainty that came from not knowing what happened to Clarence for so long. Although the trial gave them answers, it also left unresolved questions that they would carry with them throughout their lives. For the family, the case became a painful chapter in their lives, and they would always feel the emotional weight of Clarence's death, no matter what the legal outcome was. The prolonged nature of the case, which spanned years from Clarence's disappearance to the discovery of his body and Hill's eventual conviction, meant that the family lived with constant uncertainty. Even after the trial, the family had to deal with the public's reactions and the media's portrayal of the events. The struggle for emotional closure continued to haunt them, and they were often asked for their opinions or thoughts on the case, which required them to relive the traumatic events each time. Psychological and societal impact. On a broader societal level, the case raised awareness about the psychological impact that unresolved mysteries and unsolved crimes have on families. The emotional toll that comes with years of not knowing the fate of a loved one can be incredibly damaging, and the Biddle family's experience brought this issue to the forefront. The case highlighted how unresolved trauma from missing person cases can affect family for years, and how difficult it can be to move forward emotionally even when justice is eventually served. Moreover, the case had an impact on how people viewed criminal investigations, particularly the difficulties of investigating crimes where the evidence is incomplete, witnesses are unreliable, and the events took place in remote locations, such as a hunting trip. It reminded the public of the inherent uncertainties that can exist in criminal investigations and the importance of thorough, methodical approaches to uncovering the truth. Continued speculation and theories. Even after the legal resolution, the case continued to fuel speculation and theories about what truly happened during that hunting trip. Various individuals continue to discuss and debate the case in online forums, books, documentaries, and even on television shows. Some people maintain that Hill was more culpable than he was found to be, believing that there were aspects of the case that were not fully addressed during the trial. Others believe that the verdict was correct and that the death was indeed an accident, exacerbated by Hill's panic and fear. This continued public interest in the case underscored the difficulty of ever fully knowing the truth behind such incidents. Even after legal outcomes and investigations were completed, the mystery and the human curiosity surrounding the case persisted. The Clarence Biddle case, in its aftermath, demonstrated the complexities of the criminal justice system and the lingering effects of unresolved trauma, both for the family and for society as a whole.